just start with a few welcome words. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining, colleagues and friends from India and from Ireland and perhaps from other parts of the world. Thank you very much. I'm Samantha speaking on behalf of the Ireland India Institute at Dublin City University in Ireland. And it is a wonderful opportunity to welcome our speakers and our chair, Professor Eileen Connolly. And I'm going to hand over to her very shortly, just to say that this is our launch for a series, we hope, of events relating to a sort of research forum on gender and politics in South Asia. And we hope to bring perspectives from across South Asia, as well as, of course, across other parts of the world, and really to foster a conversation and exchange of knowledge and experience. And I think today's panel really exemplifies that, between practitioners, experts, think tankers, people who are working at the grassroots level, people who are working in the lofty towers of universities, people who cross over between these fields. So it's a really exciting panel, and I would like to thank especially Proma for bringing the panelists together. Unfortunately, we're missing one of our speakers, Stephanie from Delhi, who had to give her apologies due to a bereavement in the family, but hopefully we'll have another opportunity to engage with her. So thank you very much once again, and I'll hand over to Eileen to get us started.
Thank you, Jiva. I'd like to welcome everyone to this
You're on mute, Eileen.
You're on mute.
Sorry, someone must have muted me and I didn't unmute myself again. So I want to welcome you to this seminar on women's political representation, women in politics in South Asia. I want to welcome our speakers, Proma Ray Chowdhury, who's well known to me as she was my student in Dublin City University here, and also to very big welcome to our guests, Miss Kanksshi Agarwal, who is a gender activist, community developer and policy researcher. She's founder of the NETRI Foundation, which trains women who aspire to engage in politics. And also to Ms. Tara Krishnaswami, who's an eminent author, citizen activist, and co-founder of the political Shakti, a non-partisan initiative to demand political power for women in India. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. My own research has primarily been on women in politics in an Irish and a European and an East African context. I've been engaged with the Ireland India Institute for a number of years. So I've engaged with researchers in South Asia on these topics, but I am not actually a researcher of South Asia myself. But I think there's great commonalities to the barriers and issues that women face internationally. So I'm looking forward both to the engagement with academics and activists in South Asia, but also to the cross-fertilization of ideas from other regions. So the running order we're going to start with Proma, and then go on to Kanksshi, and then on to Tara. So I will ask Proma to speak now. The speakers are going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. Can you, if you have questions for the speaker, type it into the chat? Now, when we finish, I hope I'm going to be able to call individuals to ask those questions personally, but certainly all typed questions that go into the chat will be given to the speakers. So thank you, and Proma, would you like to start?
Thanks very much, Eileen, for your kind words. I also wish to thank, sorry, am I audible? Yeah, thanks. I also wish to thank Dr. Jivanta Shapri for her enthusiasm and very generous support in putting all of this together. And of course, Professor Eileen Connolly, she's been my supervisor, and I've benefited a lot from her guidance and mentorship. It is quite intimidating to be the first speaker, but I shall try my best to make sense. So Speaking of women's representation in contemporary Indian politics, we are aware of how women are critically underrepresented in, especially at the higher levels of political decision making. And as we know, the present Lok Sabha, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, has only about 78 women MPs, which is also incidentally the highest number of women MPs ever. So we can understand how critically they are underrepresented, even though in the recent years, particularly in the recently concluded elections, general elections and assembly elections, women have emerged as a distinct electoral constituency. Um, but at the same time, political parties, which are generally seen as gatekeepers to women's political participation, are lagging behind when it comes to enhancing the quality of women's representation and participation within their own organizations, as well as in the field of electoral competition. While it is true that some political parties have taken the welcome steps by increasing their number of women candidates, adopting voluntary party quotas, etc., a lot needs to be done in terms of ensuring more equitable inclusion of women and particularly creating a pro-women or women-friendly workplace culture inside these parties. So when we try to appraise the state of women's political representation in contemporary Indian politics, it will be beneficial for us to historicize the process of women's political inclusion. Now, recent research has shown that in post-independent India, women have participated in large numbers in institution building through different roles, such as voters, as elected public representatives, as economic actors, as social service workers, etc. Even though their contributions to post-colonial institution building in India has largely been very underrepresented in existing historical literature. Um, Even so, um, in the recent research, particularly in a paper by Orni Chani, it has been seen that women have faced exclusion in electoral politics from the very first elections, the very first general elections. Her paper shows how nearly 2.8 million women were removed from electoral rolls by the Election Commission because they had registered their names as the wife of or daughter of their nearest male relatives. So even though at that point of time, even though women's organizations campaigned extensively for including their names or for opportunities for date extension, name correction, that didn't really happen. So that left out 2.8 million women out of election decision making. And now we see that in the recent elections, we've seen how women are making a difference in terms of being a very salient electoral constituency. So we are seeing a lot of developments, but again, as I said, a lot more needs to be done. At the level of party politics, electoral politics, reservation at the level of rural local government has ensured the deepening of women's political participation and creating a new generation of women, grassroots women political leaders who have displayed very distinctive and gendered policy preferences, as research by scholars like Esther Duflo have shown. There is therefore, I think, an urgent need, and I guess all of us will agree that we need to urgently implement reservations for women at the higher levels of decision making, such as the parliament and the state legislatures. And alongside that, we need to take steps in order to address the gendered institutional practices within political parties, which perpetuate women's exclusion from leadership positions. And by these practices, I mean practices which are apparently gender neutral, such as candidate selection, but often very often they have the effect of excluding women at the level of practice, particularly women, Dalit women, Adivasi women, minority women. So we need to pay attention to these informal sectors as well. And speaking about the structural and cultural challenges which women generally have to face, I can speak of my very limited experience of research on women party members in the CPIM, the TMC, and the BJP, all three political parties based in West Bengal. From my case study was West Bengal in India. Um, my research was primarily an interpretivist methodological based on an interpretivist methodology and based on the feminist institutionalist theoretical framework. So among other themes, I have studied women's access routes to politics and their subjective perceptions of their respective party cultures. And that did say a lot in terms of how they face exclusion, how they negotiate discrimination and exclusion on an everyday basis. So in my research, family networks emerged as a prime launchpad for women aspirants in politics. Women spoke of their long-standing family ties that that they had with their respective parties, and sometimes, like in the BJP's case, long-standing family ties such as with non-party associations such as the RSS emerged very crucial to women's access to political capital. And this was very important because we know that there is an absence of, generally non-family community-based institutional support structures inside the parties. So even after they got inclusion in the party cultures, family networks continue to serve as support systems for women political workers in most cases. Family members helped out with domestic and childcare responsibilities. And as I said, particularly in the absence of institutional support structures for women. And in most cases, particularly with grassroots women political workers, active or tacit consent from male political, active male relatives were essential for their continued participation. In my research, I have also traced some discursive logics which played out in terms of both formal regulations as well as everyday informal practices, which contribute towards constraining or limiting women's political participation in party politics. Among these logics, there are a couple which I would like to flag. One is the imagination of the party itself as a family. And this is something that all of us are probably familiar with in terms of official party discourse and the way that women describe themselves as children of a particular family. So, and there is this connected logic of deference and loyalty to the party leadership, which is often seen as essential for women party workers to advance their political careers. The family is frequently deployed as a metaphor, and of course, when women describe themselves as children of a joint family, such imagination can, on the face value, it can imply the existence of horizontal networks among party members. But a different picture emerges when we try to contextualize this family metaphor. The imagination of the party as a family has as its source a specific historical construction of the South Asian joint family. Which is characterized, among other themes, which is also characterized by the naturalization of male authority. And this naturalization is very often translated into naturalization of male authority inside the party as well, particularly at the grassroots levels. And this particular imagination of the party as a family also plays a critical role in undercutting challenges to the authority of the party leadership through a fostering of emotional investments in the status quo of the party culture. Curiously, this is also seen, this was of course seen in the case of the TMC and the BJP, but also in the case of the CPIM, where you wouldn't really expect the family metaphor to take such a huge hold. It was also seen in the case of the CPIM, particularly with regard to the organizational principle of democratic centralism, where it is a very well-known organizational principle of communist parties across the world, and it is often marked by an authority of consolidation of the authority of the higher party units above the lower party units, and then above all centralization of party authority and stress upon party discipline, etc. So in my experience of research, this particular principle of democratic centralism contributed a lot towards consolidating the authority of the higher party units, which is primarily populated by upper caste male party members. So it in turn had the consequence of excluding women and particularly women from marginalized sections of society, through this logic of democratic centralism. And there was another sort of metaphor that was also connected to the family, but also in a way distinct, analytically distinct. There was this concept of party as a mansion, as a feudal mansion. And they used this particular Bengali term called the Upor Mohol. It means the higher tiers or higher echelons of a feudal mansion, where the elite of a family usually reside. and the lower tiers are usually populated by the servants, or that's how the feudal mansion was structured. So when women spoke about their parties as a mansion, they very subtly tried to communicate the alienation and the disconnection they faced from the higher tier or the higher party leadership. And they very often they described themselves as nichu tolar kormi, meaning grassroots workers or lower tier workers who did not really have a lot of power to decide what happened at the higher levels. And this sort of subtle linguistic maneuvers very often was very successful in terms of communicating their experiences of discrimination, their experiences of exclusion from the party's decision-making process. So I think that, I had a lot more to say, but of course, these were the primary challenges that I thought that among many that women had to face in my very limited experience. And I think that as we all would agree on what needs to happen to rectify this sort of, or rather address this sort of informal institutional discrimination is a rethinking of the gendered ideological foundations of each party. That is very essential, alongside, of course, formal mechanisms such as party quotas or informal mechanisms such as accommodative party meeting hours and institutional support systems. Alongside those formal and informal mechanisms, there needs to be a rethinking of the gendered foundations of each party, ideological foundations. For example, I can just give the example of the CPIM here, because we were talking about it when it came to democratic centralism. The CPIM had a very conflictual and suspicious relationship with feminism in the 1970s. And if we look at literature from the 1970s and the 80s, there was this characterization of feminism as a Western imperialist import. And there was resistance towards it within the party. And I think it continues to be to a certain extent. But in the recent decades, we've also seen that women leaders from the CPIM have come and undertaken a rethinking of this relationship of suspicion towards feminism. And they have recognized, leaders like Brinda Karat, they have recognized that the intersectional impact of exploitative structures such as the neoliberal order, such as communalism and caste politics, like caste atrocities. So these are the things that I think that, that showed that the CPI was trying to do some rethinking in terms of its gendered ideological culture. But of course, that did not mean in any way that that we could see a certain level of changes at the level of practice. So, number of women in leadership positions in the party continue to be woefully low. We know that even today. But then again, I think it is a welcome step that should be taken forward by each party. So I would like to stop here and looking forward to receiving questions and comments and engaging with my esteemed fellow panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Proma, for a very interesting presentation. And one I think that will complement, I'm absolutely certain will complement our other speakers. So I could ask Kanksshi to speak now. And could you also introduce yourself again and also say what your paper is when you start speaking? I would be so grateful. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. I don't know if I have a paper, but definitely I'm representing NETRI Foundation. It's an incubator and aggregator for women in politics. And I'm very, very thankful to Ireland India Institute, Jivanta, Eileen, Proma for having me here today to be able to speak about the work that is being undertaken exactly to question these, deep-rooted cultural discrimination that we face in the society that we live in. And while so many challenges might be common between countries like India or even like across the world, because gender in itself is such an intersectional construct, right? It comes from so many languages, region, religion, all of that. But at the same time, there are some commonalities that we find in the South Asian region. One of our work that we put together in the first year of NETRI starting is around a comparative analysis in South Asia. And we look at the commonalities of the challenges, the barriers through 3 points of view, which I'll come to. But before that, I would also just take a moment to introduce what NETRI does, our big audacious goals, and the construct of the organization and what the ideas behind that are. So let me know once you're able to share this, see the shared screen. Okay, can you see them now? Okay. So I'm not putting it in the full screen mode. I hope this is visible enough. Is it? Yeah. Okay. So starting with this thought that, where women do not have the right to, not only have the right to vote and to elect, but what Promas shared about 2.8 million women being left out of the electoral roll is one of my favorite anecdotes to even say that how deep rooted our understanding of our identities is, that we are either going to be associated with any man of the family. And then following on that, when Proma also brings in the concept of family and how dynasty, interestingly in India, has come under a lot of thwarting, this demonization of the concept of dynasty in India, but it has interestingly been one of the enablers for a lot of women politicians in India. And what you see in terms of representation has been enabled by it. The extent, the quality, and the effectiveness of those women is definitely like highly varying. And there are questions around that. What could they do within parties, and at what cost did they get the positions that they did? But definitely, at least in terms of number, and Amrita Bazu's paper expounds quite a lot on that. Moving to this idea that we wanted to have more investment, encouragement, and inspiration, and more pathways for women to be able to choose politics, because as we know, politics is still looked at as this, this closed web of information and uncodified principles of trust and mores of how to do politics is still held by the political elites. How can we uncodify that? How can we decentralize that for a group, which is 50% of Indian population, to be able to access that kind of information and resource networks in the first place? So what we are trying to do is we are working with the vision of engendering power and decision making, and achieving that proverbial gender equality through political equity. In India, there has been a lot of schemes, policies, and investment, if I may say, in terms of CSR money or government's initiatives that went into women's education, health. But at the same time, the kind of investment we wanted to do in the capacity building of women's political leadership has been absent largely from the scene, apart from the reservation at the panchayat and the local level. And this idea that politics impacts us all, but at the same time, this 700 million women, which is 50% of the population, remain unheard, unvoiced in the parliament. One of the books that Tara has written a chapter in, one of the, that book has one other chapter by one of the member of parliament, Kanimori, who's given facts and statistics on how, when the women in Indian parliament, whether it's Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, as the number wavers, the number of issues that are raised in the parliament wavers, right? It goes up with the higher percentage of women. The kind of also subjects that come into the parliament varies depending on who's speaking about them. But we all complain about having a society which doesn't have infrastructure completion. Politics is criminalized. We don't have enough social infrastructure in the country. And if we want all of that, we know that the answer is women leadership, right? Because they have been able to, and these are again 2 papers by Sonia Balhotra, where she talks about better economic performance, or 25% growth premium on the GDP at a female legislative level. She did this research on the MLAs in India. Similarly, that there is a higher chance of infrastructure completion when a female is in power. Having said that, we in India have this obsession of becoming a world leader. But I always ask this question: how can India be a world leader, lead and be on the global scale when we are ranking 122 on a gender inequality index, right? Which essentially means that how will you be able to go there without taking 50% of your population along? And we are also one of 48 on the International Parliamentary Union, which essentially means that we are really not performing well on the representation of women. Just to show the scale of the problem, it is 9% on an average across 28 Indian states and 14% in the Indian Parliament, as Proma mentioned. But to bring it down to solving a problem, right? These are very, very big problems to be solved. So we at NETRI set out to understand what are the 4 major blocks where interventions can take place. So knowledge, motivation, resource, and behavioral gaps are the biggest gaps that we found in the ecosystem. And that is why the organizations for 4 pillars are around training, providing them a resource aggregator platform, mentorship, and building the community. I think community could be a very good replacement for the word family. And there's an anecdote. I was meeting somebody yesterday, a female politician, and she had this interesting thing to share about how she motivates other women to join. Very interesting, because she said, like, how we are in the family, we are largely safe. Like this idea that when we are in the family, we are safe. But the moment we go out of that, we are going to be, unsafe. So how can we claim the public space? And politics is going to become a new family for you, who you can call if somebody is, harassing you outside the safety wall of your family. Now, I think the construct is that you can feel safe if you have power. She said that you could call up people and say, hey, don't harass me. I know powerful people, or I belong in this particular party. And if you're in the ruling party, it is even the better. You could almost you could talk to the police directly, and they would also have that kind of a power equation with you, which is a very interesting thing when she shared. I think one of the audacious attempts could be, how can we create this community spaces which are safe for women and stands up to their needs of political ambition when they want. If families are not one of the ways to enter into politics, because not all of us do have families, right? Which can propel our careers in the field. Having said that, so as I was talking about challenges, there is also a small fishbone on what are these challenges. There are strategic, there are motivational challenges, because politics for anyone is largely uncertain. It is not a very individualistic pursuit. There is a lot of network effect that comes into play. What is the timing of it? Winnability is usually spoken about, that, maybe you're not winnable from that seat. Reservation, for that matter, is sometimes, and I've heard a lot of women saying, we were working on one constituency, I was nurturing that constituency, but you know what, in delimitation, the constituency has gone to the other side. So I couldn't get the ticket from the same party. The party thought that, there is a better representative who will be able to capture the larger vote share, because the demography of the constituency has changed. So the uncertainty of it could also be a big challenge in keeping women and other people motivated in politics. And how long do we get as women? I think even choosing any other profession, how we are told that, you go to high school, you finish university, you decide what you want to do in next 3 years, because then marriage is online. And I think one of the prominent concepts that have also come in Bangladesh is that women need to be married, and there was something that's a part of our report, which says all the women who were contesting at some point, all of them were married except one. And this woman was talking about how nobody wants to marry a politician woman, and she was starting to be considered outcast. Very interesting concept, because it also happens in India. So it was like, okay, Bangladesh, happenings, like similar things happening, also because given the similar demography, the similar cultural aspects of the state. Having spoken about that, the few things that we've been able to do in last few years has been that there are so many women who are aspiring now. They want to do this. And usually the questions comes to us, when do we start? How do we start? Where do we start? The why part is mostly, it's coming from a lot of passion that we have been doing a lot of social work, but we don't see the work happening. People are almost blind and deaf to our needs. The why is usually in place, but how do we start? How can we manage a political life is usually a question. One of our, and Achal is definitely one of the favorite people that I've had, because she wrote to us in 2020 and her email boldly said, I want to become a politician now. That was the subject line of her email. And what I'm showing on the right side is that this year she was given, and completely to her credit, I think we are honored to be a part of her journey. She joined a political party. She came for our training program. Now she's also nominated in a very significantly interesting role, because her MLA has nominated her on a child protection committee in the constituency, replaced. But what is also interesting about this notification is that they have to have a woman on that. There was another woman who is now replaced by Aanchal, which is very interesting to have made those connections, to gain that trust, to figure out where can she start fitting in the ecosystem. So completely to her credit. When I say these programs, what are these programs doing? These programs are mostly giving them pathways to politics. But the second one that we figured this year is called Samantha Ambassador Program, where we're not only saying that, hey, become a candidate, but why don't you also try becoming a political trainer, a political professional, a campaigner or organizer on the ground? Because again, a lot of women, they want to so much be a part of the ecosystem, but for whatever reason, sometimes it's like, hey, I don't have it in me and I really don't want to do this. I don't want to be on the front facing, but I really want to be in politics. Is there a space for me? Can we create space for such women? So that is an adventure that we are on to, finding these campaigning opportunities or creating these parallel roles for them in the political ecosystem. Ultimately, what this aim is, like why NETRI is working and why we are being supported, is because we want to do this issue-based, value-driven, tech-enabled politics for women. Technology is, I am a personal believer. In my previous capacity, I used to be a technology policy researcher, and I'm a strong believer technology is not going to go. And how much ever it is touted as a level playing field, technology is still very biased, and it is still leaving a lot of people out of its access. So can we enable women through tech to be able to connect to this idea better? And I think social media is a very good starting point for most women. They want to understand how social media, the big data companies are a big part of understanding how politics is now being done. Very unfortunate that politics has started happening on Twitter. But the reality of it is, it's happening not only on Twitter, it's another added layer. It is still happening in the constituency. But there are two kinds of politics now: the big narrative politics and the constitutional, the constituency-based politics. To navigate both of them, certain parties actually came up with this interesting filtering mechanism that you have to have certain number of followers on Twitter to even be eligible for a ticket, or you have to have a presence on Twitter. If it's not like a following, but how actively are you engaging? Having said that, I want to come to the three issues that are common to women in South Asia, which is access to finance, lack of access to finance. Second one is violence, and third one is patriarchy and cultural barriers. Taking a moment to ask one of the questions on this forum is how to implement mainstream gender development agendas to tackle this financial capital, which acts as a big barrier for participation of women in politics, has been a question, because most of the time, because of these opaque, extremely complex funding laws or lack thereof, some countries do not have any regulatory practices around campaign funding. women find it extremely hard to be able to even think about politics, because one, the agency is anyway lacking in the whole inheritance of property, that they don't get inheritance. It was only in 2020 a case called Sharma versus Sharma, where women were given a right to inherit property in the ancestral joint Indian family. So though the law has been around for some time, I think this was a case that came about. But one, there has to be some regulations for fair campaign finance allocation. And second one is increased gender responsive budget to reduce the resource gap. We see that, gender responsive budgeting has not been implemented to the spirit of it, which essentially says that women still do not have equal pays. They still do not have access to similar opportunities in the economic space. Having said that, I'm going to switch to one of the other screens because I wanted to expand a little bit more on this paper that we had mostly written, where we were trying to compare all the countries and look at the country name, the women in parliament, women also in the ministerial position, the barriers and the law that are in general addressing the women issue. So we wanted to see that there are some countries which are over legislating on women, and still there are so many cultural, financial, and these violence-based barriers that keep on preventing women from having to even get benefited by the laws that are being legislated by in the country. So if you look at some of these, they might seem very obvious, unfortunately. But like say I talked about a lack of access to campaign finance, lower employment rate, this dominance of men, and then there is this hota system in Maldives, where men cafes, they can discuss politics and women have no access to these hotas. Similarly, the social capital, how it enables Indian politics, as I always say, the chai tapri politics, essentially these small chai tea stalls and chai stalls where a lot of men gather around to discuss politics. One of the other things is that women, whenever they are moving out of the household, there is always a question asked as to what purpose are you leaving the home for. This idea of just going around and chilling and socializing with people significantly disables them from getting a social capital, which can in future turn into their political or financial capital for their politics. Second one was mostly against this, when we again talk about opaque electoral bonds in India, which came about a law in 2017. It has significantly kept these smaller parties who are not able to get any access to larger finances that are coming through electoral bonds. That has become a big problem. Afghanistan, we all know about the political instability due to Taliban and the culture of violence that has been perpetrated. And the financial constraints in the country were anyway, even before the Taliban takeover, were significantly high. Happy to share more of this, but I would like to stop here for some time and share more anecdotes as we go along. And giving over to other speaker Tara to speak about her experiences, and yeah, that's that.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. And I personally have lots of questions, which I will not abuse my position of chair by asking now. Can I urge people who are listening to submit questions to the chat as we go on? Don't leave it all till the end. So if you have any questions, sort of put them into the chat so that we can process them as we go. And can I invite Tara to speak now? And again, Tara, if you could do a very quick introduction of yourself, because other people have joined since I spoke about you. Thank you very much, Tara.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you to the Ireland India Institute and Jivanta for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. It's entirely my privilege. And it's also my privilege to speak along with the esteemed panelists, Proma, and Kanksshi, both of whom are good friends of mine, and we've collaborated and worked together as well. So I'm thrilled to be here with them. And it's a challenge to follow their acts, but I will do my best. I'm Krishnaswami. I'm actually a technologist by profession. I have been a citizen activist, a policy influencer and author for about a decade now. And I've dabbled in a variety of things. And one of the things I do is Shakti. Shakti is a citizens movement that has been working on increasing women's representation in state assemblies and parliament by running citizens ground campaigns, grassroots campaigns. So I will share a bit of, I'm a practitioner, not an academic, so forgive me if my approach is a bit proletarian, if you will. So with that, I will actually start by sharing something, sharing a film, a short film that Shakti made. This is in order to create awareness in voters as to the importance of women's representation. So I'm going to play it, and if you can see it and hear it, please do give me a thumbs up so I know that it's visible.
आई 1 लीटर पानी ले लूं, हमें 10 किलोमीटर बोलना, कहना देखबो तो।
आज हमार गुड़िया हमार बिया में आयल बिया, कैसे देखबा तू?
हम घौन पात छी, पर घरों के कागज में नहीं छी, केना देखबो तो?
हमारे स्कूल में लड़कियों के लिए शौचालय आज भी एब्सेंट है, कैसे देखोगे तुम?
रोटी के बदला एक फेरो बेल्टे खेलिए, कोना देखबो तू?
उ फेरू कॉलेज के रास्ता में जबरन लिफ्ट देवे खातिर आ गई, कैसे देख पा तू?
Thank you. We made this film during the Bihar election campaign. Shakti tends to run campaigns around elections. So a lot of my observations will come through the lens of electoral politics and the citizens' campaigns we've run around those. Let me share with you the experiences using my presentation. I'd like to say that the laws, the legislations that are passed in the Indian assemblies and parliament are really mangislations, what should have been sound legislations, because issues that impact women and issues that are about women as citizens, and in particular, gendered issues, are there's hardly any women's input that goes into those issues by virtue of the fact that women are pretty much absent from these places. So I think this kind of captures the solution pretty cleverly. The difference between a male view, a male gaze, and the female gaze as far as policymaking goes and governance goes. So one of the questions that was sent ahead was around the data of where India stands with respect to women's representation in the higher echelons. I'll focus on the parliament, and I'll show you a set of data that talks about this. If we look at male and female MPs in the Indian parliament, the lower house of the parliament, the Lok Sabha, from 1957 to 2019, which was the last election, you will see that, of course, we have the highest ever number of women, too few yet. And there has been, for the most part, a very, very slow increase in the number of women. The uptick this last time was actually the largest uptick. There have been times when, it has even dipped a bit. If you look at the Council of Ministers in India, which are drawn from the MPs that belong to the governing party or the winning party, I hesitate to use the term ruling party, you can see that barely 10% of cabinet ministers are female on average, including this time the Council of Ministers, it comes to 10 point something. So despite, even if there are women to draw from at the very highest echelons, women are not given an opportunity. On the other hand, a clear indication of the thirst for political participation of women comes from our voting patterns, which started this graph starts at 1977, with just 55%, the 10% point gap between male and female voters, and has almost exceeded, and female voting has almost exceeded the male voting percentage at this point, or has equaled it. If you move from parliament to the state assemblies, the data is equally dismal. We barely have 9% female legislators in the state assemblies on average. The best is about 13 to 14%. West Bengal has 13%, and Chhattisgarh has 14% female MLAs. And you can even see states with zero female MLAs. Women are not even allowed to stand for elections in Nagaland, for example. A stark contrast, of course, are the women in the third tier in the local governments, both rural and urban. And you see between 33 and 50% women, and that is because of, in fact, over 50% women, where women have won in general seats as well. And there are about 14 lakh women across India currently, 1.3 million or so, 1.4 million sitting elected women in local bodies. And this is, of course, because of the 73rd and 74th amendments that imbued reservation in the local governance to women, a third to half. Now, shifting our view to how parties behave, as you can see, 50% now of the female electorate votes. 50% of the votes come from the female electorate, 50% of the population almost is the female population. And yet we see that even in the last 4 general elections, barely 8 to 9% of candidates fielded have been women. So the outcomes, of course, cannot exceed the inputs. And if you have an input throttling at about 9%, it's very difficult to imagine sort of a representative parliament, if you will. Now, when this data, and this data is available in public domain, and in some ways it's of common knowledge too, because every voter goes to the voting booth and sees the ballot paper, so to speak, symbolically, and the ballot has, 1 in 10 women or less. So every voter knows that this is the case. But one of the biggest barriers to women's political representation are the myths that shroud this, right? When they see that 9% of the candidates were women, the narrative, there is sort of a deadly narrative between the data. The data is spun into a deadly narrative, and then that, becomes a sort of an absolute barrier for women to cross. So one of the narratives that's spun is that perhaps there are so few female candidates because there's not enough women in the pool, so to speak, women that are available to parties, so to speak, to award candidacy to or to give tickets to stand in elections. But the data is in direct contrast to that. I've just taken an example of one state, and this is true for every state due to the 33 to 50% reservation of women. In any given large state, you have about 25,000 heads of local bodies, panchayat heads that are women, a total of 277,000 elected in urban and rural positions. They could be ward members. Therefore, there's a really large base to draw from. And if you add up the entire country for the 2.5 decades that the reservation has existed, you end up with about 1 crore of women. But then you also see that even women who have made it to becoming mayors, and I've taken a case in point because it's an excellent sample, the women's wing chief of the BJP, ex-chief of the BJP, Vijaya Hedkar, who was the mayor, was denied a ticket in her own constituency. Similarly, you have, if you therefore prove that indeed there are 10 million women who have at some point been elected, who have administrative experience, who can now be drawn from the pool to become legislators and policymakers, then comes the narrative that says that, you know, they're not really interested. Women are not interested in politics. These women were stood there because of reservation, and they really don't have a genuine interest. Well, if that's the argument, then, well, parties have come forward and claimed publicly on their websites, made announcements every time the number of female members in their party, which is a voluntary membership, has reached a certain threshold, right? The BJP, for instance, claims there are 3 crore female members in the party. The CPM claims, the Communist Party, Marxist, claims that they have 1 crore members. And these are just examples. Every party claims, you know, millions of female members. And we do know that, you know, the rate at which independents win in India is very, very low. So given so many women have voluntarily come into parties, and so many women have also won and have the governance experience, why are they not being given tickets to stand for elections? So if that's the question, then the narrative now deflects to, well, perhaps women are not winnable. Now, that's entirely false, because the rate at which women are winning actually exceeds the rate at which men are winning. They're not being fielded only in safe seats, because you can't imagine that a dozen seats can be safe for any party. In fact, if any seat was safe at all, our prime ministers and chief ministers routinely run in 2 seats in order to make sure that they don't lose their candidacy. So if you look at the data for the winning rate of men and women, the purple is women and the pink is men. And you see that for every single election, that the women's winning rate exceeds that of men. So women are more winnable than men, if anything, in every single Lok Sabha election. So nothing justifies this except that you have embedded and entrenched patriarchy. In some sense, parties are petri dishes of patriarchy, if you will, in India. Now, if they do cross the barrier, and the 9% on average of women that do become candidates during the elections, you see that that party men from across the aisle, you know, their competitors, so to speak, their rivals, are constantly deriding them, right? The amount of misogyny and sexism that they face in the electoral arena, in terms of you know, calling her names and personalizing commentary, can be really shocking, that what the women have to go through. And by the time they go through it and win, you now have even media that kind of portrays women in sort of traditional, familial, you know, glamorous kind of roles, romanticizing them, or even sort of reducing them to dolls, if you will, right? And just a couple of days back, we had an MP from Parliament, one who's usually pretty respectful of women, post a picture with a bunch of female MPs saying the Parliament is more attractive a workplace. From casual sexism to overt misogyny, it runs the gamut, right? We can't imagine, for example, our Home Minister, who's male, you know, a picture of him and a headline that says, you know, grandpa is grumpy, right? He is a grandfather. But you can't imagine Amit Shah's picture and a grandpa is grumpy headline, for obvious reasons. So these are samples of the kinds of barriers that, you know, women need to face, and the narrative that's built around them. Kanksshi referred to dynasty as well. The point is, in India, in some sense, everything is dynastic, right? The businesses that are run are passed down from father to son. Marriages are endogamous, which means that the entire caste is related to each person. So everything thrives on male family networks. But when it comes to research, a lot of researchers wear their lens only around female and the dynastic influence. And in some sense, it sticks out like a sore thumb, because women are so few, A, and B, women's dynasties change when they get married. But for men, you know, the bringing in your nephew, you know, your wife's brother, all of this is kind of invisible, because all you're tracking is, you know, father, son, or father, daughter, or husband and wife. So I think women really get the short shrift. And if we kind of classify these, we can, they kind of fall into the gendered roles that society thrusts on them. Institutional masculinity, and I deliberately call it masculinity and not patriarchy, that we see in political parties. It's really testosterone-driven politics. And then we see a very loaded democratic infrastructure, if you will. I don't know if someone's trying to send a message to me on chat. I'm not able to, focus on that because of this. Now, if we drill down a bit further and look at the gender roles in society, I think Kanksshi and Proma referred to this as well, from the lack of agency to choose their own careers, to not having overt support. I know extremely well-to-do women with their own independent earnings who are not allowed to spend their money for their sort of electoral ventures. And then similarly, there are MPs that have said to Shakti in public that, for example, it's conditional on a bar. Like in the next 5 years, if you don't make it to being a member of parliament, sorry, you'll have to quit politics. And that's the kind of restriction a husband or a family puts on them. Of course, financially, women are even worse. The economic equity of women in India is even worse than the political equity. So, like many other countries, it takes an enormous amount of money to run even for the lowest office. So I think all of these become issues, significant issues. The political party, I would say, is the single biggest issue, because even the women that manage to come through have a very, very difficult time in political parties. The women's wing is pretty much just a body count for, vote catching or showcasing how many women they have. It's very, very difficult to actually start in a women's wing, grow in a women's wing, and end up anywhere that counts. Women are very scarce in party leadership positions. Less than 10% of party leadership positions are held by women. So they don't decide. Sort of real estate is gold in party politics, right? You have to be a district head. You have to be a constituency chief. You have to be a state in charge. And if you don't have those positions, then you don't have control over building your base. You don't have control over, who gets tickets, who becomes candidates. And of course, your own candidacy is then at stake. And therefore, you don't play a role in party decision-making in influencing that. And finally, I think there is a lot that needs to be said about, and this itself can be a panel, the democratic infrastructure in India, which is very loaded. It's kind of fraught. The Election Commission, for example, has the authority to register a party, provided it meets certain criteria, but doesn't have the authority to deregister a party if it stops meeting those criteria. For example, parties have to commit on the constitution to be democratic and to be fair and to be representative, right? That's the Representation of People's Act. But when it comes to fielding candidates, if they field 0 females, or 1% females, or 2%, or completely disproportionate to the demographic, the Election Commission can't even wrap them on the wrist. We don't have political party laws and regulations as you have in other countries like South Africa, for example, where they self-regulate to ensure that no gender exceeds 50% or a certain threshold of representation. We have campaign finance that's just out of control. And we don't have ombudsman like some of the Scandinavian countries do. Like the National Women's Commission could be an ombudsman that says, regardless of whether you're talking about, boards, government institutions, or you're talking about parties in politics, we want to make sure it's representative. We want to make sure that the women are not sexually harassed. We don't have ombudsmen that play those roles, and therefore elections really aren't quite free or fair, if you will. So Shakti is, has entered this space to say, look, we are not going to be a one-trick pony that just demands a women's reservation bill. We are going to be a nonpartisan platform that works with multiple stakeholders. We will work with political parties to apply pressure on them to increase the number of female candidates they field. We will work on promoting female candidates themselves. We will work on with the government and the MPs in tabling the women's reservation bill. And we will also influence voters in sort of voting for women, if you will. So I won't go through, we've done dozens of campaigns, but I will just sort of give you a flavor of how we approach the problem. And this is just some set of volunteers. We have lots of volunteers. We have done roundtable discussions, bringing in the media that covers politics, to female aspirants, to sitting MLAs and MPs, to political commentators, to talk about sort of foreground, if you will, the fact that women's representation is so skewed in India. And we do this during the time of elections deliberately to drive both media, voter, and party consciousness towards this. We've brought in, women elected through the various tiers to have this discussion. We have provided representations, petitions, if you will, to political parties, urging them to give half the tickets, half the field, give half the tickets to women. We have worked with sitting legislators themselves and got them to lend their voice to this campaign, saying, the sitting MLAs of the party themselves beseech their own party, in the upcoming elections to field female candidates. We've done that, at an India level. We've done that in state campaigns. We also ran a very interesting campaign during COVID, because we couldn't get on the streets, called the Selfless Selfie campaign, where the local body representatives in Bihar and the head of the rural government is called the Mukhya in Bihar. We reached out to female Mukhyas, and there are thousands of them, to themselves demand that 50% of the candidates should be women across all parties. And this is important because if you think of the voice of an elected representative, be it in the local government, and she carries about 1,500 votes or so behind her, or the voice of an MLA who carries lakhs of votes behind her, these voices demanding 50% women's representation on the ballot, if you will, they lend a lot of credibility to our own voices as civil society. Now, from the party, as I said, we look at all of the stakeholders, the parties, the candidates, the government. From the party, we focused, yeah.
Can I ask you to draw to a close in just you have a few more minutes left? Sure, I'll do that. Thanks.
We've also campaigned with the Election Commission on the ground to discipline the parties. We've, of course, worked with MPs, if you will, asking them to table the women's reservation bill, both in terms of a phone campaign. For the first time, historically, volunteers called every single MP. We've had, ground campaigns asking for the women's reservation bill. And you saw the movie as well, the short film, which was released during the Bihar campaign to increase voter awareness. Now, what is the effect of this? The effect of this is that there is a lot of media conversation, public conversation, both in regional and national media, TV, otherwise, and we get the politicians themselves to speak about women's representation. So the net result for the Lok Sabha elections, for the particular 2019 election, we saw the two large parties, the Trinamool Congress and the BJD, ended up giving, not due to Shakti's work alone, but it's our contribution towards this, in addition to everything that happened, that we saw both the Trinamool Congress and the BJD give 33 to 40% tickets to women, and the number of women in the Lok Sabha increase. I'll wrap up by saying that the gap is huge. And as I said, there are structural barriers and cultural barriers. And we've been working, around we haven't been working around, legal electoral campaign finance. And we've been working around, the parties and the people and the people side of things, if you will. But what needs to happen, what has happened, what we have accomplished is to say that, not only some parties have given a large number of tickets to women, we foregrounded the whole conversation during elections. There are more women in parliament than ever before, but also the biggest positive that I see is that there's a surge in young female aspirants. NETRI itself came up after Shakti did, but there are a large number of groups and a large number of young female aspirants attending training and classes, some of which I'm involved in as well. And what needs to happen, though, moving forward is if we really want to fast forward women's representation, there is no other option but to legislate hard limits, what's called women's reservation. I'd like to say they are hard limits against gender gluts, similar to the 73rd, 74th Amendment. Of course, the gamut of election commission reform to electoral reforms, regulating parties around nominations, and of course, bootstrapping women's political careers, all of which helps, and citizen pressure that we're talking about. But really, the fastest way, if you will, is a legislation. And that's also, in some sense, what we can count on to keep this going. Tomorrow, if the players change, the number of women in parliament could drop, suddenly as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm just checking. I'd like to ask a general question, and then I'd like to call if Priyanka would like to ask her question personally, if who's ever in charge of this meeting, which is the technicalities of this meeting, which is not me, could get Priyanka after I've asked my question, and then I'd like to call on Jiva. And my question is it's a question for all three, and it's something that always bothers me, because I'm totally on board with what Kanksshi and Tara are doing, and I know the necessity of getting more women into politics, whoever they are. But I always have that balance between seeing politics as disembodied from ideology in a particular set of, seeing politics as a technical institutional thing, and seeing politics as an ideological space where we contest what sort of state we want to live in. And there's so many examples around the world of the focus on the institution of politics and institutional fixes basically producing an empty shell. And I just wanted you to reflect on that issue. I'm now going to ask Priyanka, wherever they are, if they would like to ask their question.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. This question, I think, is to everyone, is that, and I think I was thinking about Kankshi's presentation about a young woman like Achal saying quite openly that she wants to become a politician. What have been your experiences? Are there more women who want to really be a part of politics, but then across different age groups and across different socioeconomic strata? And is it because I think there seems to be a lot more participation of women in politics in southern India, but I was just wondering if there is any demographic mix in other states, but also from older women, because I think there's a lot of focus on the youth and the aspirations and the optimism of the youth. But what about older women who've seen it all and are more possibly realistic and know the challenges? So yeah, but thanks so much for this very interesting presentation, everyone.
Thank you for that question, Priyanka.
We just take those two and then come back to Jiva. Okay. In case we overload, given Jiva's was a very interesting but slightly different question.
Yes. So you want me to come back?
Yep, please do.
Should I answer it right now, Eileen, or should I?
Oh, no, answer it right now. I mean, I don't really care what order the three of you come back in. And okay. You jumped in, you get first shot.
Sure. I'm just going to first respond to Priyanka because that's a very interesting question. Of course, I would say the civic participation is definitely from women's and is higher in southern India, as you rightly pointed out. But to take the case and example of Achal, yes, there are multiple women who are interested. We have right now till this point engaged with over 160 women. One of the current programs is also centered around how these pathways are built, and for everyone there will be a curated journey. So for example, for somebody like Achal who had already been working in the social sector, for her she'd already decided that she wanted to jump in some of them are still exploring, they're still in college. Very smart women who come to me and say, hey, I'm studying journalism and law, like, either journalism or law, because I want to get into politics. So these are two very, associated professions. So people have thought about some of the professional moves that they have taken early on. So we have participation from 19 states, where in these 160, I wouldn't say that there are so many from one or the other, but definitely tier 2 cities, access to telephones and mobile networks is predominant right now, where women to come to our trainings, because through the COVID, we have been doing this over Zoom calls. But interestingly, Priyanka, where NETRI started in 2019, we were in 4 districts. That was the first pilot. I wanted to even understand. You would have heard about the self-help groups in India, the SHGs. They have millions and millions of women. They emerge as almost as a block, and they have so much understanding of how to maintain a ledger, how to understand finances, to take loans from the government. So they have this basic literacy, I would say, where they have started understanding the system so well. So the 4 districts that we captured were in UP and MP, and wanted to speak with them. How do you amongst yourself decide to ever contest in panchayats, right? And we wanted to say that if the economic empowerment, if I have to say, is translating into political agency, how are they participating, not only in terms of interacting with the government, but also taking leadership? What interestingly emerged was that they do take very consensual decision on who's going to contest. A woman comes and says, can I, if you understand Hindi, hum ban jaye kya is baar? A sarpanch or mukhia. So they ask that question, and they say, all my women supported me. So that idea of community is also so strongly held, because they know that they have to be within that same SHG. So if they get their support from there, it will be easier for them to make that inroad into politics as well. That work is still pending. We have to go back now and start working with SHG women more. Third, on the question of age, yes, we do have that age demography also between 24. I prefer to work with women who are almost coming out of college. So that first year to third year, they have spent their time exploring. From 24 to 54, this is the age group that we have worked with so far. But the only limitation on our work is that we're not working with women who we cannot train. In the sense that they will have to have a capacity to sit through, absorb a lot of knowledge that is coming through, training and what is being spoken in the theoretical framework. And just including Eileen's question on that, politics as contesting institution, career, profession, versus politics also as an ideological ground. So why do you want to do politics? What is your internal resilience to do politics? If people are able to work with that kind of framework and setting, they're definitely a great candidate to work with for us. Women who are older do not have so much literacy or have gone beyond that stage. I don't know how this can help them work, but of course advocacy campaigns like what Tara mentioned, what Proma was also talking about, getting them as supporters would be a great approach to get them included in the process. I hope that answers some bit of it.
Yes, thank you. Proma, would you like to come in next?
Sure. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, everyone, for your wonderful questions. I think coming to Eileen's question at first, I don't know if I've understood it correctly, but I think you were asking whether politics should be about, like Kanksshi said, about contestations and institution building versus politics as more agitational politics, which is based on ideology.
I was actually having an angst about the pitfalls from any project like Tara and Kanksshi are engaged in. And someone mentioned South Africa. We can see it in South Africa, where you have high-level institutional reforms and quite a bad situation for women on the ground. That's what I'm having the angst about. I'm having the angst about how do we have institution building with progressive change. It was an angst.
Right. So I think when it comes to whether this sort of technical based politics is harming the chances of more ideologically grounded politics, I think of course Tara and Kanksshi would be able to answer much better than me. But seeing from my very limited experience of research and general reading about events, particularly during the recently concluded general elections and state assembly elections, I think that uh, you know when I asked women why they wanted to do politics, like Kanksshi said, what was the motivation of doing politics? Women mostly talked about making changes. Like they were actually aware that things were not that great, so as to say, both in terms of institution building as well as in terms of their respective ideologies. But it is true that very often they adopted the very similar sounding metaphors, but connoted very different things. I'll just give an example of Seva. So women from the TMC, the Trinamool Congress, when they talked about Seva being their primary motivation for joining politics, they said that they primarily meant that they wanted to be part of this institution building, developmental welfareism of the Mamata Banerjee government. And the term they used was unnoyan, unnoyan meaning development and the rest of it. Primarily characterized by welfare schemes, social welfare schemes for women like Kanyashi, Rupashri, etc. So that was what TMC women meant by Seva. And when it came to women from the BJP, for them, Seva meant serving their community, the Hindu community, creating a Hindu vote bank. That was their aim of, their expressed aim, at least, of joining politics. They wanted to defend Hindu interests. So you see how ideology also came in very, and it was tied very smoothly with their motivation for joining politics. And I'm not saying that the TMC women were without ideology. It was very ideological, of course, because many of them talked about regional pride, and particularly it, as the state assembly elections in West Bengal grew closer, this rhetoric of regional pride grew even stronger. So that was probably a way that women tried to bridge the ideology versus, or just complementing the both the regimes of technology and ideology. Not that those two are distinct in a way. And when it came to the CPIM, women used the term Sangharsh or Shongharsho in Bengali and Sangharsh in Hindi to characterize their motivations for joining politics. And what they meant by that was more like an internal Sangharsh, an internal struggle at becoming a defeminized, degendered, revolutionary communist person, and a revolutionary communist activist or whatever it is. While at the same time, this struggle was to be directed at the prevailing state of affairs, like, the capitalism, neoliberalism, exploitation of workers, etc. So that was a struggle on the external side, and there was an internal struggle which was to be waged and carried on throughout their lives. And somehow connected to this is Priyanka's question, whether older women are also interested similarly or are similarly aspirational or not. I have seen that in the case of the Communist Party, as well as in the case of the BJP in particular, that there were women who have devoted their entire lives and chose to remain unmarried so as to, serve their parties, and actually were rewarded for it, to be honest, like, because they were seen as women who did not have any kind of trappings of the family, to deflect their attention, to divert their attention. And that itself is a problem. I'm not saying that it is a good thing, but they were rewarded for such defeminized subjectivities, developing such subjectivities. So, and, particularly at the local levels, I have found that women were very aspirational, and, some women actually described themselves as addicted to politics. Like, the word they used in Bengali was nesha. Nesha means addiction, in a bad way, of course, but here it was used as a very positive sense. So they said that politics is my addiction. I always, I can't live without it. And there was a woman councillor in a local municipality who joined.
Proma, can you pick up the pace.
Yeah,
I'm just actually anxious. We haven't even I've got 2 questions outstanding. We've got to have shorter responses, otherwise Jeeva is going to be kicking us off this seminar.
Sorry, so just I was just wrapping up. So there was this woman who said that she joined work and she joined her, official duties as a municipal councillor just 4 days after her husband's death, because she couldn't live without politics as such. I mean, that is quite pressurizing, because women can't be seen as vacating the field, so as to say. I mean, if they do vacate the field, if they do take a vacation, they are supposed to be leaving the field and leaving it open to other competitors. And the struggle is harder for women, obviously, but it is quite refreshing to see their resilience and to see how positively they view their political careers and political aspirations. So I'll just stop here and look forward to listening to other speakers.
Right, Tara, and obviously, Tara, this is a hint that try and keep it brief.
I will, since most of it's been covered. I'll just make 3 points. One, to Priyanka, outside of party politics, I actually see a lot of women, both very young women and older women, very interested to enter politics for the first time. I mentioned that as one of the most positive things, is the surge of young aspirants. But recently, for example, I was working with 50 aspiring women in Tamil Nadu, in a particular constituency, between the ages of 35 and 55, right? And they are interested because now they've finished their domestic duties. For many of them, they've had their children are of a certain age, and they have sort of the luxury of thinking of pursuing politics, right? So that is one little thing that I say. The other thing, I want to get to what Denise said specifically for me about why the voting percentage of women went up after 2009. The Election Commission after 2004 took a very specific set of actions to increase that. For example, they separated the male voter lines from the female voter lines, so women could stand in their own line. And a lot of rural women felt much more comfortable, because if you look at the voting lines in India, they run for kilometers. And I mean, I'm being figurative here, but what I'm saying is this extremely crowded space, and this jostling and standing with a whole bunch of strange men is a very intimidating thing for all of us, not just rural women. So and then they also did pink booths, and they did a whole host of focused voter recruitment and sort of initiatives that made women feel welcome at the voting booth. So that helped. And to Eileen's amazing question, in a sense, it's philosophical, Eileen. Democracy itself, institutionalized constitutional democracy, is the gap between that and the reality of India is very large, right? So in a sense, all institutional reform, all legislation, all policy that is in sync with that is a sort of is an ideal, is a vanguard, if you will, for people to follow. So then you got to ask yourself, how long are you going to, and people are not one block of people. India is extremely diverse, and different states are in a different state of political maturity. And unfortunately, we don't have the autonomy, don't have the federalism for states to devise their own electoral laws and, electoral reform. If so, we could experiment much more easily with institutional reform and see how well people follow. Some states are in a much better position to do that. But you've got to ask.
Sorry, can I ask you also to pick up Jeeva's question when you're doing this one now, which is about the electoral system itself being the problem? So when you're, tag Jeeva's question onto the end of this discussion, if you would.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, we've also got to ask ourselves, how many of these young aspiring women are we going to deprive because of sort of the lack of adherence to the spirit of democracy by the political parties, right? Parties that want to give, 9%, 8% tickets to women. In a sense, you're also depriving opportunities for women all over, and you've deprived them for decades now. So how long we've got to balance that with, okay, if I hit you on the head with legislation, are you actually going to follow through? Are we actually going to get the results we want? It's a convergence. It's going to take a while. We know that this is a, 100-year project, I guess, but we're going to do what we do. I meant from the beginning of constitutional India. I don't mean from today. So I'm hoping in my lifetime I can see some change. But electoral reform is of dire need. Proportional representation, for example, is something that most democracies that India borrowed from, including the UK, and most advanced democracies, sane democracies, have moved to, that India has resisted, which is a pity because that opens doors without reservation, without legislation, to create voting blocks much more easily, especially in a diverse country like India. You can imagine, at least in certain constituencies, strong women being able to create a certain, block of voters for themselves. And once you taste a certain reasonable degree of power with proportional representation, you can build on that. Today, the barrier to entry is very high because it's a first past the post, all or nothing kind of a thing. So I think that's the single biggest electoral reform that needs to happen. But then, of course, there's campaign finance reform. It's India's actually slid back with that, and public funding, for example, or a better combination of public-private funding can certainly help with this.
Can I ask if Kanksshi or Proma would like to come back on the Indian electoral system that is a problem and a barrier? I'm in
complete resonance. Yeah, I'm in complete agreement, resonance with Tara on the first past the post system being a big problem, and proportional representation, especially given the diversity that we have of caste, religion, because even within, so one of the criticisms when the first time the women's reservation bill was proposed, that it will only enable a certain caste of women, and then there was a reservation within reservation to enable that, there must be Dalit women, tribal women, SC, ST, OBC, and it should be a intersectional representation. I think what Tara speaks about is the proportional representation will enable that kind at a much local level. And also one of the interesting things about the report that I shared was, for example, in Sri Lanka, there is a law sort of that the woman of the deceased politician cannot be put on the electoral, choice list. That also, these kind of barriers, instead of easing things up, different democracies in the world have found ways to keep women out. And I'm reading this very interesting book right now, which is essentially, I'm sure that you will have heard about it, How Democracies Die. One of the very interesting commentary that the author makes, and I'm trying to apply the same logic here, that they say it is the duty of the political parties, they are the gatekeepers of democracy. It is their duty to keep the authoritarians and the authoritarian streak of certain leaders and thwart it at the grassroots. I think they have applied that kind of thwarting to women's aspirations because they've been gatekeepers in the sense that they do not let them rise up the rank. This kind of lack of opportunities for women in the political parties has also emerged because political parties have been benefiting with keeping women out of power, because they almost have the audacity to say hamari seat, like, we'll lose our seat, like as if, they've inherited it from their great grandfathers. Now this electoral system reforms, and again, Tara mentioned how Election Commission has become just an institution which is not doing so much about enabling women's participation. And voter block is something, I think this idea that women started to participating more as voters is also because, okay, we want more votes. Where can we go and look out for more votes? Enabled it. Okay, find more votes, but find voter blocks for women themselves. Two great examples emerged out of Bihar and Tamil Nadu, where women consolidated as voter blocks against alcohol in the states. And they were able to turn the power around. Like, they all agreed, all caste, all religion women agreed that we don't want alcohol abuse in our state. So these are two good examples, but can we then find ideologies, as you rightly say, or things that directly impact all women across different dividing lines, to come together and say this is not going to work because it really does not benefit us as women. And being a feminist, a progressive feminist, I think that is something that a lot of us have problem with, the casual sexism, or what are we allowed to do and not do. All of us just need to become feminist, I think.
on that high note, the call for a feminist army we will end. And I would actually like to thank Proma, Kanksshi and Tara for a really interesting talk and a very, very interesting seminar, and the feeling that we've only just scratched the surface of this. So hopefully we will have a rematch sometime in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Jivanta.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Jivanta.
everyone. Tara, Kanksshi.
Thanks
It was
for
a pleasure
joining,
to
giving
speak
your
with you and
time.
collaborating. Thank
I
you.
noticed that we are color coordinated as a panel, but yeah, that's not on purpose.
Yeah. Now, I'm actually just going to pass over to Jiva now to close the meeting.
Yes, well, just to reiterate, thank you to the panelists, to Eileen, for giving up time to join us. We don't even have the benefits of the social interaction and the tea and biscuits, so it's pure selfless act here. And also thank you to my young colleagues, Rituparna and Kusumika, who supported with the logistics and a poster. So, this wouldn't be possible without our community of scholars. And I'd just like to reiterate that the Ireland India Institute is really promoting this creation of a community of scholars across disciplines, interinstitutional linkages, thanks to this panel, some really exciting new opportunities to engage with your institutions and your work. So I think that's the main aim of such events, and we need to build on that then and make it something bigger than just a one-off interaction. And I also hope we'll have a few more panels coming up with speakers from different parts of South Asia, because I think it'll be really intriguing to see. There will be certainly parallels, but I'm sure, we've talked a lot about institutions, and I think Indians obsess about institutions, and politics is in our bloodstream. And so it'll be really fascinating to see if the same thing is the case in other contexts, or what are the dominant themes that emerge out of those discussions. So I'm really looking forward, and hopefully we'll be advertising some more events to follow through. And
do keep us in the email loop of the other events happening, and we can also compare notes, listen to other speakers.
Absolutely, we'll build on this. So Proma, thanks for bringing us together, and now keep us going as well.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.